6 this morning. We're still going to be evolving around the Old Testament and somewhat and involved with the book of Exodus about where we're at. But I thought we would come here this morning and shift gears a little bit and look and see what the New Testament has to say. And we're going to find that Hebrews chapter 9 has got a real good overview of what we're talking about in Exodus chapter 26 on through the balance of the chapter, okay? So we're going to be seeing some types and shadows in these things. But anyway, one of the things that we need to realize here in Hebrews chapter 6, beginning at verse 18, and I think this is real important that we need to get a real clear concept of this because of the salt that's on the Bible, that's on the Christian religion, and so on and so forth. We've got to remember that there's two immutable things in which it was impossible for God to lie. Now, you say, well, Bobby, what's that got to do with anything? Well, you're going to find that in the world, a lot of times, because of religious confusion, there are people that believe that God has lied to them. But God cannot lie. His promises are strong and sure. And notice what it says here, that by two immutable things, it's impossible for God to lie. And so a lot of times, you know, what this comes back down to, and we've said this a lot, and this is really important too, sometimes you got to get past Genesis chapter 1 and verse 1, in the beginning God. There's 3 words right there, in the beginning God, 4 words, in the beginning God, that has to be reconciled in the heart and minds of people. If that's not reconciled and in some type or form of belief system, whether they've obeyed the gospel or not, but actually some type of belief in God, your work's cut out for you. Because the rest of it, it's a moot point. And so that's why it's important as Christians, as we're out and about in the world and we hear things on television and the news media, to realize that it is impossible for God to lie. If there's a problem or a conflict within the Word, it's not coming from God. It's coming from man, and man in turn is getting it from who? The old arch enemy is who? The devil, right? He wants that muddied water, so to speak. If he can just muddy and cloud the water a little bit, then he's won, hasn't he? So, but anyway, because it's impossible for God to lie, we have an anchor of the soul, and when you anchor something, what is it? It's kind of rooted down, isn't it? It may can sway a little bit, but when a ship is anchored, it's in place, isn't it? And we know that even though it can move about a little bit, and our lives are the same way, our souls can be anchored in Christ Jesus, but we still have the weather of the world, don't we? But yet if we're anchored, we're not going to move away. We may shift a little bit and come back to where it was originally moored, but the anchor's going to be there, isn't it? And we'll be there. We'll be in the same vicinity that we're in, like this ship. And so we have a hope that's an anchor of the soul. It's both sure and steadfast. And so there you are. We have security in that. Not only is it sure, when something is sure, that means it's locked together, right? Just like that anchor is attached to that ship, okay? And supposedly, without the weather, the ship in calm water, it'll stay right there, won't it? Okay? So it's steadfast, isn't it? And this is what we're to be today. We're to be both sure and steadfast. And which we have both has an anchor of the soul, both sure and steadfast, and which entered into that within the veil, wherefore the forerunner for us entered, even Jesus made a high priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. And so we find that it was a high priest that entered the veil. One of the things that we were going to have in the lesson this morning is this morning on PowerPoint was Brother Gus Nichols years ago had drawn just a little diagram about the tabernacle, about the courtyard, the holy place, and the most holy place. Well, the only person that could enter the most holy place was the high priest. Okay? And that's what he's talking about here. There was a veil between the holy place and the most holy place. And of course, in the holy place, that's where the Ark of the Covenant was, and the mercy seat where God would meet the high priest who gave atonement for sin once a year. But you know what's interesting about that tabernacle? It had one door. In other words, the priest had to go through the holy place first to get into the most holy place. Well, before they entered the holy place, guess what had to happen in the courtyard or in the altars of sacrifice? A blood sacrifice was given, and we touched on it briefly. We hadn't got there yet. And then they had to wash what? In the basin that was there. Then they will enter into the most holy place. And the high priest was the only one that could enter into the most high place where the Ark of the Covenant is at. And what he's getting at here, that veil has been torn down today that separated the holy place and the most holy place by Christ Jesus. You know, in a sense, the veil is still there, in a sense. Let's look at it like this. We're in the church, right? Have we seen heaven? Have we entered into heaven yet? Even though Jesus has tore that down, we haven't seen it yet happen. So that's yet to come, isn't it? And so when you look at that, you can see a type or shadow of the courtyard where the sacrifice took place and where the basin was at. It's kind of like it unto the world, as Brother Gus Nichols and Brother Gaddis Roy was talking about in their analogies, and we'll hopefully get to that a little bit more. And the only way you could enter the holy place was by being consecrated by the blood and the washing of water. What does that remind you of? So the holy place becomes representative of the church. How do you get into the church? Well, you got one door to get in, haven't you? Not physically, but spiritually. Well, what's required to get into the holy place or the church? The shedding of blood and the washing and regeneration of baptism. So you become consecrated. Without that, you can't get in. Spiritually speaking. Now, yeah, the physical door is open and we want people to come in and out. Yeah, right. Okay? But to be into the holy place, one has to have the impact of the blood and the water. And then the only one that could enter into the veil separating the most holy place from the holy place where the ark was at was a high priest. Well, who is our high priest today that's entered in to that veiled area? And we're going to see this. It talks about that. Hebrews does a really good job on this as this unfolds, okay, of explaining that. What Jesus Christ has. We haven't entered in, have we? We're in the church. You could say we're one step away, right? Okay? But until Christ comes again and completely breaks that barrier down, we're still separated from heaven on. Which is a type of the most holy place where God is now dwelling with them. And I hope I didn't get into that too deep because I want to get on over here into that. But it's really interesting when you begin to look at the types and shadows of these things. Now, this high priest that we have is not after the order of Levi. Jeff, by the way, I'm doing this ad lib. I don't have any notes, okay? So if I veer off too much in one direction, Daniel just holler at me and say, Bobby, you need to go back this way. I just, throw something up there like a piece of paper. I get the message, okay? All right, so doing this ad lib. Dangerous, but And so we find in verse 20, whether the forerunner for us entered, and here we go, the forerunner that entered for us is who? Jesus Christ. Now he's not after the Levitical priesthood. The Levitical priesthood was after the order of Levi, the Levitical priesthood. Christ did not come through that lineage of priests. He came from a different lineage of priests, didn't he? Christ's family was not of the tribe of Levi, were they? Even though they were of the tribe of David, both Joseph and Mary's lineage tie back into David. But they were not. David was not a priest, was he? He was a king, wasn't he? And so we find that we're going to see that this is a more perfect priesthood that came about after, he says here, the order of Melchizedek. And it gets real interesting about the study of this Melchizedek, but that's who Christ's priesthood is after the order of. And we know we've studied Melchizedek and we read about him there in the Old Testament, and we'll turn there in just a minute. You find him mentioned numerous times here in this particular chapter of the book of Hebrews. And so we find as we roll into chapter 7, in verse 1 it says, "For this Melchizedek, king of Salem, priest of the Most High God, who met Abraham returning from the slaughter of the kings and blessed him, to whom Abraham gave a tenth part of all. First, by being interpretation, king of righteousness, and after that also king of Salem," which we know that's the city of peace, and later Jeru would be added to Salem, city of Jerusalem, or city of peace, and that's Jerusalem, okay? So, and after that, also king of Salem, which is king of peace. So, we find that this Melchizedek comes into play with this priesthood. It's kind of interesting what it says about Melchizedek when you look at it. We often, and maybe so, refer to that and think of that as a name of a person. But if you notice how it's used in the Bible, is it a name or is he after an order of priest of God? And I'll show you what I'm talking about here in just a minute, because the name Melchizedek means king of righteousness, is what it means, or preacher of righteousness, okay? And so when you look at this, you kind of have to ask yourself some questions about this. And notice what it says here. Let's look at Hebrews chapter 5 and verse 6. And I'm just going to hit some high points and then we'll move on. "As he saith also in another place, thou art a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek." So after the order of Melchizedek. It says also when we turn back over to Hebrews chapter 7, notice what it says here. Beginning in verse 11, "If therefore the perfection were by the Levitical priesthood, for under it the people received the law, what further need was there for another priest should arise after the order of Melchizedek, and not after the order of Aaron?" So you see that term, order of Melchizedek. Now, and you see this again here in verse 15. In verse 21 and other places too, after the order of. So this order of priests like Melchizedek, when you say order of something, what do you normally associate with that? When I say, and maybe this is not a good example, fraternal order of police. Is that a name or is that a lineage of police officers that's in that brotherhood? So you have to, ask yourself some questions about who this Melchizedek was. I didn't want to get into that too much. Maybe sometimes we'll do an in-depth study on Melchizedek from what we know about him in the Bible, and plus what we know about it historically. So, but anyway, it's kind of interesting at who he was. As a side note, and maybe this will kind of whet your appetite a little bit, to do some personal study on your own. Notice what it says here in 2 Peter chapter 2 about Noah. Noah is referred to as a preacher of righteousness. What does the term Melchizedek mean? King of righteousness, preacher of righteousness. Notice what it says here. "And spared not the whole world, but saved Noah, the eighth person, a preacher of righteousness." So, is that not maybe an order of priests that God has had throughout this whole thing? So, but what we do know about Melchizedek, and I'll get back more to the point of the lesson, is that Abraham, whoever he was, okay, and I'll say it like that, gave tithes unto him. So Abraham recognized Melchizedek as one of religious authority. Now, how about that? Separate and distinct from anything that we know of. And if you turn back over there and you look at what went on there in Genesis chapter 14, and let's turn there and read that. The reason I'm going back this far and not directly on the tabernacle yet, I want you to see God had a plan in all this. There is a pattern, there's a thought process on all this. You know, you don't stop and think about it, but Sodom and Gomorrah might not have existed without Abraham's attitude. Did you know that? Because when you get here, what had happened here in Genesis 14? Big war. These various kings from these different tribes, if you will, had got together and they attacked Sodom and Gomorrah, didn't they? Well, when they did, they took the people and the spoils, but who else did they take with them? Because who was in Sodom? Lot. And now Abraham gets his army together, if you will, to go get his nephew, Lot. Isn't it kind of interesting that maybe more than once Lot has to be bailed out? You know? Abraham has to go get him to bail him out of being a captive. And then later on, the angels are going to have to drag him out, Daniel. Not pick him up, drag him out. He didn't want to go, did he? You know? Kind of interested in that too. But notice what it says here. And I'm just going to kind of pick up in verse 18, and you can go there and read that about Lot and Abraham. And in verse 12, they took Lot, Abram's brother's son, who dwelt in Sodom, and his goods, and they came more than escaped and told Abraham about it. So Abraham, gets all his people together, and they're going to go down there and take all this back. But I want you to notice something here. It says about after he had brought back, verse 16, all the goods, and Lot his brother, and the women, and all the people, that these other kings had taken. Notice what it says here. There was one Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought forth bread and wine, and he was the priest of the Most High God. Kind of interesting what he brought with him, wasn't it? Bread and wine, didn't he? Are we seeing something significant in this? And notice what it says here. And so Melchizedek blessed him. Blessed be Abraham of the Most High God, possessor of heaven and earth. And notice what it says here. And he blessed be the Most High God, which hath delivered thine enemies unto thy hand, and he gave him tithes of all. Now watch this. And he gave him tithes of all. And so we find the king of Sodom said unto Abraham, give me persons and take the goods to thyself. And Abram said to the king of Sodom, I have lifted up mine hand unto the Lord, the Most High God, the possessor of heaven and earth, that I will not take from a thread even thy shoe latches, and I will not take anything that is thine, lest it should say, I have made Abraham rich. Kind of interested, isn't it? At the interaction that Abraham now is having with the king of Sodom. And later on, what was going to happen? The very place going to be destroyed, wasn't it? We don't stop and think about it. But we find that Abraham gave a tenth to this Melchizedek. He recognized Melchizedek as one as an authority. Let's turn back to Hebrews chapter 7 and get a bigger picture of this, okay? I'm not going to get where I want in this, Daniel. I didn't know I was going to spend this much time. I want to get over there where that tabernacle at, see? But I wanted to back up a little bit, right?
It almost sounds right there like Abraham's telling the king of Sodom, I didn't do this for you.
Right. I done it to get my brother's son back. Because there's a bigger picture that's going to go on here. Yeah, because he was following after the plan of God, is what I'm getting at. Now, how much he realized what was going to happen to Sodom in the future, it's almost like what you said. He's not doing it for the king of Sodom. God has a plan for the king of Sodom, doesn't he? And Abraham doesn't want to interfere with that plan. And so we find, as we go back here to Hebrews chapter 7 and verse 2, I'm going to read verse 1 again. For this Melchizedek, king of Salem, priest of the Most High God, who met Abraham returning from slaughter of the kings and blessed him, to whom also Abraham gave a tenth part of all. First being by interpretation, king of righteousness, and after that, king of Salem, which is the king of peace. So it's kind of interesting about what we know about this Melchizedek, and I'll use it just like a name, like we always have, because we, that thought of it being after an order of priest is there. So, but anyway, we know that he was a king. This priest, was a king there in Salem. But also he was a priest of the Most High God, wasn't he? And Abraham recognized him as one in authority. And so we find that it says here in verse 3 about Melchizedek, and there's a lot more read into this than I think that it actually means. It says that without father, without mother, without descent, having neither beginning of days nor end of life, but made like unto the Son of God, abideth a priest continually. So it says without father and without mother. Now you're going to find when you go out there and look at that there's all kind of thoughts and ideas on that this guy was some type of forerunner. He was a forerunner to Christ, but we know God's Christ's father was actually God of a virgin birth. That was a miracle. This guy somehow was a miracle of God put here because he didn't have father. That's not what you're talking about, okay? Whoever this priest was that met Abraham and all, he seemed to have been of established age and had lived so long that it seemed like he didn't have father or mother. So he was an old guy, And, of course, we don't encounter people like that much today, but if Brother Conn was here, I still say, Brother Conn at his age, he's lived so long that it seems like, where's the beginning and all? It's like, to us, in our eye. So, whoever this guy was, he had longevity there. And without descent, having neither beginning of days nor end of life. So whoever this was is living a long time. Now, let's get to the shadow part. Who's it talking about here? Christ. Technically Christ, didn't have a conventional, how do I say this, conventional type birth, did he? Okay. God was a father. Mary was his mother, but you got to look at that and not like we traditionally think of things, right? Okay? Did Christ have beginning of days? Does he have end of days? No. So we see a shadow of Christ in this person, Melchizedek, at whose lineage Christ is going to come from as far as the spiritual side of it, as far as the priesthood side of it. Okay? So, I'll pause right there. Didn't you, brethren, got anything you want to? I know I'm running kind of fast, but I have something I want to get to, but I may skip all this other. So, you find that there was a purpose and plan in this. We find, I'm going to have to come on down here. Verse 11. If therefore perfection were by the Levitical priesthood, if that priesthood was perfect, if there was nothing else that could be done to take away sin, then why would you need another priesthood? Well, you wouldn't. You wouldn't need another priesthood. And notice what he says here. If therefore the perfection were by the Levitical priesthood, for under it the people received the law, what further need was there that another priest should rise up after the order of Melchizedek, and not be called after the order of Aaron? So why would you need another priesthood? Why, if that law was in its perfection? Well, we know it wasn't, and like I say, as we get into the Hebrews 8, 9, and 10, which it doesn't look like we are today, but you're going to find that it was a necessity that the priesthood be changed because the law was changed. Notice what it says here. For the priesthood being changed, there is made of necessity also of the law. So if the priesthood changes, what else changes? The law. Well, what's it talking about here? The priesthood of God. And what law is it today? Let's just call it the law of the gospel, right? Okay? That law is now in effect, because one of the things we find as we look at this in Hebrews chapter 8, beginning at verse 7, notice what it says here. If that first covenant, if that first law, if that first agreement, if you will, had been faultless, that means without spot, without blemish, no error, Morgan, no margin of error, okay? if it had been faultless, then notice what it says here. Then should no place have been sought for the second. No need for a second law if that first law would have done everything it was supposed to do, was it? If the blood of bulls and goats could take away sin, what's the point? It's there. But notice what he says here, for finding fault with them. Finding fault with them. So the law was faulty, wasn't it? But it had a purpose and plan because God had to bring his son into the world, and he was using the Hebrew race or the Jewish people to bring this about. It was under imperfection. For finding fault with them, he saith, behold, the days come, saith the Lord, while I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah. And this is talked about in Jeremiah chapter 31, verses 31 through 34, but the writer of Hebrews here is going to give us an overview in verse 11 of what that says. Okay, so we won't turn there. For this is a covenant, verse 10, that I will make with the house of Israel after those days, saith the Lord. I will put my laws into their mind, I will write them in their heart, and I will be to them a God, and they shall be my people. And they shall not teach every man his neighbor, and every man his brother, saying, know the Lord. For all shall know me from the least to the greatest. So what's he talking about here? Well, under that old law, if you were born into a Jewish family, then you were what? In the law, what? You were a Jew. Okay, you were born into that relationship. So what did they have to do? They had to teach you about the relationship you had because you were naturally born into it, okay? But now, how does the new spiritual law work? Well, you're not taught that way anymore. You're taught before you are born into. It's talking about the heart, isn't it? You're taught the gospel. The gospel now is how you get into the covenant relationship with God. It's no longer the law. And so we find that we won't be going about and talking to our neighbor who says, well, you know, you're born a Jew, you're under the law, you're in a covenant relationship with God, do you understand that? It's natural birth. And we don't do that, do we? No. What do we do today? What do we do today to tell people how to get in that covenant relationship with God? Well, we tell them about repentance, confession, and baptism in the church, don't we? And that's what it's talking about here. That new covenant, it's not like that old covenant. And so he says in verse 13, a new covenant, he hath made the first old, now that which decayeth and waxeth old is ready to vanish away. And so what he's talking about, Christ came and did away with that. Now, notice what he says is ready to vanish away. One of the things that I don't think that we get a picture of a lot of times is the Jewish temple wasn't destroyed until AD 70. The church was established, most common dates, and most common commentators use AD 33, so we'll use that for the sake of discussion, okay? So, when this is written, guess what was still standing? The Jewish temple. It'll be standing another 8 to 10 years depending upon the AD date on this. So had it totally vanished away yet? Physically it was still there, wasn't it? But what had to happen to it in the end? It had to go away, didn't it? Okay? So that's what he's talking about there. This new covenant's come into effect, so now the old one is ready to do what? When something vanishes, it just disappears, doesn't it? Well, what happened to the Jewish system? What happened to the Jewish temple when the Romans went in there? Gone. Never to rise again. And so, historically, now you have to ask yourself a question that God in His infinite wisdom, we know He uses people in the world to carry out His will. What is now standing and has been for centuries after century after century, what is now standing where the Jewish temple used to stand? The Islamic Dome of the Rock. Kind of wild, isn't it? Is that not a symbol that God meant that to stay on? never to be resurrected. It's kind of like the Dead Sea, and we're all going to get to the tabernacle a little bit. The Dead Sea. Why is it called the Dead Sea? It's not good for anything. Salty. I've never been over there. Daniel's been over in that area. I haven't. And my understanding is you could throw a rock out there in the Dead Sea and it's so salty the rock will float. Okay, it's not good for anything. Well, what was there at the Dead Sea from what we understand and know? Well, somewhere in that area, at the foot of it, or in that area where that Dead Sea now stands, is the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah and Zone and all those wicked cities were in that area. Well, what happened to them? Well, God destroyed them, didn't he? You know, when he talks about the destruction of Sodom over in 2 Peter chapter 2, where we just read about Noah being a preacher of righteousness, it also says he had destroyed the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah, and what's there now is good for nothing. Is that not a road block or a road sign saying, stop, you're fixing to get into trouble, here's a monument to all this? Now this is a side note that Peggy and I saw on a video on television, that they had done some studies over there, and they had found some of the in the diggings, they had found some of the I'm going to call it ashes, if you will. And as they studied those ashes, it was unlike anything they'd ever seen. Fire and brimstone came from heaven, didn't it? It's not an ash like you think of a conventional fire. So it was destroyed by God. So that evidence, you know, if you look at the science, is that it stands for reason, doesn't it? When you look at it. So anyway, that's what we have here. So that old is ready to vanish away. Now, Hebrews chapter 9, the imperfection of the legal sacrifices. Now, I say all that to get to this. Then there the first covenant had also ordinance of divine service and a worldly sanctuary. So what was the tabernacle? A worldly sanctuary. Do we have a sanctuary today? Yes. What's it called? The church. Spiritual. Okay? For there was a tabernacle made, and that's what we've been talking about. The first wherein was the candlestick, and the table, and the showbread, which is called the sanctuary. Remember, we likened that unto the church. And after the second veil, the tabernacle, which is called the holiest of all. And that's the second part of it, where the ark of the mercy seat is. Notice what he says in verse 4. Which had the golden censer, the ark of the covenant, overlaid round with gold, wherein was a golden pot and matter, and Aaron's rod that budded, and the table of the covenant, talking about the 2 tables of stone, the 10 commandments. And over the mercy seat was the cherubims of glory, shadowing the mercy seat, of which we cannot now speak particularly. So what's he talking about there? Well, really, he's saying, I really can't go into too much detail about them cherubims and that mercy seat, because they're all gone. From what we understand historically, the first time the temple was destroyed, all that was taken away with it too. So we don't know where it's at. Really, it don't matter what Harrison Ford and the Raiders of the Lost Ark do. We don't know where it's at. Okay. Then.
The interesting is that everything made of gold would even be here today. Everything made of gold would have been here today if they would have just, followed God.
Yeah.
Because gold is not rust.
No. And you know, if you want to really think outside the box and think a little bit out there in the distance, that gold is still here today. It's been melted down and recycled and everything else. You know, you ask yourself a question about that temple and the treasures that's over there in the Middle East. You know, that place is wealthy. Not only in oil. Makes you wonder about some of the stuff, because all that temple being layered in gold, what if that layering of gold was only 1 millimeter thick, or 40,000ths of an inch, roughly? Think about it. There's no value on it. You can't compute it. Okay? Just like with this tabernacle we're going to talk about next week, the boards around it that held the curtains up or the tent up was covered in gold. So just stop and think about it. It kind of boggles the mind in a lot of ways at what's going on here with all this. And so we find, let me read on. Let me do more reading than do anything else. Verse 5, and over the cherubims of glory shone the mercy seat, of which we cannot speak in particular. Now when these things were thus ordained, the priest went always into the first tabernacle according to the service of God. The priest did that in plurality. They went into that holy place. Okay? But into the second, who only went in? The high priest. He's the only one that can go in there. And he does that once a year. But the second went in, the high priest alone once every year, not without blood, which he offered for himself and for the errors of the people. So he did some atonement in there. He's an intercessor, isn't he? Between the people and God. So who's our intercessor today? Jesus. So he's likened unto Christ. And Brother Roy has in his book, he spends quite some time. He's got 3 chapters in this book dealing with nothing but Hebrews 9, Exodus chapter 40, Exodus chapter 35, and Daniel, Exodus chapter 26, where we at. Okay? And the types and shadows that's in this. So hopefully I'll have PowerPoint back up next week. Okay? Verse 8. Where am I at? I might skip on down here. Okay, let's just go down to verse 11 for the sake of time, okay? Well, I do verse 10. This only stood in meats and drinks and divers washings, carnal ordinances. So see how he explains that tabernacle in verse 9? It was a carnal ordinance, okay? But now we have a greater tabernacle today that's not made with hands. All that had to be handmade. Okay? The boards had to be cut. The tenons had to be cut. The dados had to be cut. And we'll show a little bit about that next. For all this to fit together like it did. So, it was very laborious to build. So, but now, verse 11, Christ being come a high priest of good things to come, by a greater and more perfect tabernacle, not made with hands, that is to say, not of this building, not of the building of the tabernacle, not in that manner, not in that format, nor was it by the blood of bulls and goats, but by his own blood he entered into the holy place. Okay? That's how he's a high priest. Having obtained eternal redemption for us. How about that? So we did get there, didn't we? And that's what we've been talking about. And like I say, there's even more to say about this, but sometimes if you got a minute and want to just read through something real carefully and think about what it's talking about, Hebrews chapter 8, 9, and 10 does a really good job of explaining what was going on with this tabernacle in the wilderness and the tabernacle that we have today. Now man will build them a building. Some will call it the sanctuary of God. Out on Highway 82 where I come from, they had actually built them a tabernacle. And what it was a pole barn with a sawdust floor and had wooden benches in it. But you know, that's man, isn't it? That's not a real tabernacle, is it? Used to be a sign up that said Whitewater Tabernacle. A lot of times when some of you were probably going to Tuscaloosa, maybe to some of the ball games and stuff like that, you've probably seen it and didn't know what it was, okay? But that's not the tabernacle. It's just a man-made structure by some kind of name, okay? Because in that real tabernacle, if you're going to do that now, and we've been talking about this on Wednesday night, then you're a debtor to the whole law, right? Where are the sacrifices? Where's the blood atonement? Where's the veil? And Paul said you can't just take part of it when he wrote to the church at Galatia. It's all or none. And at best, he said you are fallen from grace to try to do those things, you see. So anyway, we'll have to stop right there and get ready for our worship service. I know didn't have any pictures and all like that. Next week, I'm gonna make sure that I dodge Microsoft and they goings on. So anyway, we'll get ready for our